Across the galaxy on the Council's capital world of Nexus Prime, the battle at Haven's Rest was being broadcast through official channels, and what had started as routine monitoring of a Vorlak raid had become something entirely different, and ambassadors from hundreds of species sat in the Grand Council chamber, watching in stunned silence as a single human frigate continued to hold off an entire enemy fleet. The Catharan delegation sat rigid in their seats, and Zixtal's mandibles clicked rapidly in a way that indicated extreme agitation and confusion, and he kept saying that this should not be possible, and that humans were fragile and weak, and should have been destroyed in the first engagement. But the evidence on the viewing screens contradicted everything his reports had said about humanity. On those screens, the Valiant executed another impossible maneuver, using the planet's gravity well to slingshot around and attack from an unexpected angle, and more kinetic rounds struck vulnerable systems on another Vorlak warship, and the enemy vessel went dark and began drifting without power, and that made 3 ships crippled by a single frigate council chair Gorath, who was a massive being made of living crystal, watched the battle with interest, and his voice resonated through the chamber as he observed that 3 warships had been disabled by tactics that no council species had ever considered using, and he wondered aloud whether the council's assessment of humanity had been fundamentally flawed. Back at Haven's Rest, the situation inside the Valiant was becoming desperate, and the ship's hull was scored with damage from shrapnel and near misses, and half the weapon systems were offline, and they were running on backup power for critical systems, and the crew was exhausted from hours of constant combat and high-stress decisions. Daniel stood on the bridge, and he could see the fatigue in every face around him, and Maya had a cut across her forehead where a console had exploded and blood had dried on her face, and Lisa's uniform was torn and stained with coolant fluid from when a pipe had ruptured, and Amy's hands shook from the strain of maintaining intense concentration for so long. The young crew members looked like they had aged years in just a few hours, and Peter's face was pale and drawn, and Karen moved stiffly because she had bruised her ribs during a hard maneuver, and Jake had burns on his hands from fighting a fire in the weapons bay, but none of them had given up, and none of them had stopped fighting. The last transport ship finally reported that it had loaded the final group of Tilqui civilians, and the captain said they needed 15 more minutes to secure everyone and prepare for jump to hyperspace, and Daniel looked at his tactical display and saw that the Vorlak fleet was beginning to move again, and they were positioning themselves to intercept the transports before they could escape. He asked Maya if she had any ideas left, and she pulled up the tactical display one more time, and her voice was hoarse when she spoke, and she said they were out of drones and out of missiles and down to 1 functioning kinetic cannon, but they still had one advantage, and Daniel asked what that was. Maya said that the Vorlak still thought like predators, and they expected prey to run and hide and try to escape. But what if the Valiant did not run? And she suggested they charge directly at the enemy fleet, and Daniel understood immediately what she was proposing. And Lisa said quietly that it would be suicide. Maya agreed that it might be suicide, but she pointed out that the evacuation ships were heading for the jump point on the other side of the planet, and the Vorlak had positioned their fleet to intercept. And if the Valiant charged the flagship head-on, then the enemy would have to choose between maintaining formation or protecting their command ship, and either choice would create an opening for the transports. Daniel looked around his bridge one final time, and he told everyone that they could leave now and get to the escape pods, and no one would judge them, because they had already done more than anyone could ask, and he waited to see if anyone would take him up on that offer. Not a single person moved, and Lisa said with respect that if he tried to make anyone leave, he would face a mutiny, because they had come this far together, and they would finish it together, and Daniel felt pride and fear and sorrow all mixed together because he knew what he was asking them to do. He ordered Amy to plot a course directly at the Vorlak flagship, and to push the engines to maximum speed and beyond. And Amy's voice was steady when she acknowledged the order and said that finally they had a plan that did not require fancy flying. The Valiant turned, and its damaged engines strained, and the ship began accelerating directly toward the enemy fleet, and not away from them, and not around them, but straight at the massive warships like a missile locked on its target, and the crew held their positions and waited to see what would happen. On the Vorlak flagship, Warlord Kraven watched in disbelief as the human ship charged directly at him, and he could not understand what they were doing and whether they had gone insane from damage or whether this was another human trick. and his tactical officer reported that the Valiant was accelerating past maximum safe speed, and if they maintained course they would impact the flagship in 90 seconds. Kraven felt something he had not experienced in many years, and it was doubt mixed with genuine concern because this tiny ship had already crippled 3 of his warships using tactics he had never encountered. And what if they were not desperate but were actually planning to ram his flagship? And what if they had loaded their ship with explosives, or had some other surprise waiting? The humans were small and fragile and should have been easy to defeat, but they had proven to be unpredictable and relentless and apparently willing to sacrifice themselves, and Kraven realized that he did not want to find out what would happen if that ship hit his flagship, and he made a decision. He ordered all ships to break formation immediately and execute maximum evasion, and the Vorlak fleet scattered as each warship moved, to avoid the charging frigate, and their careful blockade dissolved into chaos, and in that moment of confusion, the Tilqui transport ships emerged from behind the planet and shot through the gap in the enemy formation. Lisa shouted that the transports were clear, and they were jumping to hyperspace, and Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him because they had done it and they had bought enough time and the civilians were safe, and that had been the whole point of this impossible fight. He ordered Amy to get them out of there, but the Valiant's engines had been pushed beyond their limits for too long and they began to fail, and power died across multiple systems, and the ship started to drift without thrust or maneuvering capability. Karen's voice came over the comm from engineering, and she said that the chief engineer was unconscious and they had fires on 3 decks and the reactor had shut down in emergency mode, and they were dead in space with no way to restart the engines quickly enough. Daniel looked through the viewport and saw the Vorlak fleet regrouping and turning toward them, and the nearest warship was only minutes away, and he knew that this time there would be no clever tricks or desperate gambits that would save them, and he gave the order that he had hoped he would not have to give. He told everyone to get to the escape pods immediately, and Lisa started a protest, but he cut her off and said it was an order, and they had done their job and saved the civilians, and now it was time to make sure his crew survived, and the evacuation began. Crew members helped each other to the escape pods, and those who were injured were carried by those who could still walk, and Peter refused to leave until Maya physically pushed him toward the pods and told him that he had done enough, and that everyone had done enough and it was time to go. The escape pods launched and scattered in different directions, and the Vorlak ships ignored them because they were focused on the Valiant and on making an example of the ship that had humiliated them and caused them so much damage and embarrassment. Daniel stood alone on the bridge and watched the enemy warship approaching, and he felt tired and sad, but also satisfied, because they had accomplished what they set out to do, and 3 million civilians were safe, and his crew was safe, and that would have to be enough. Then his console chimed with an incoming transmission, and he saw the Council's official seal appear on the display, and a voice said that this was Council Battlefleet Omega, and they had arrived early and were ordering the Valiant to hold position. Through the viewport space suddenly filled with light as 30 Council warships dropped out of hyperspace, and their weapons were already charging, and they had been racing to arrive for hours and pushing their engines to dangerous speeds, and they were still too late to help with the evacuation. But they were perfectly timed to save 1 damaged human frigate. The Vorlak fleet saw the Council armada, and they did not hesitate or try to fight because they were already battered and demoralized, and they had lost 3 ships to a single human frigate, and they were not going to face 30 fresh warships, and they jumped to hyperspace and fled before the Council ships could engage them. Daniel slumped into his chair and suddenly felt every injury and every hour of stress and every impossible decision pressing down on him, and his hands were shaking and his vision blurred, and he realized he might be crying, but he was too exhausted to care. The Council ships moved to secure the area and began recovering the Valiant's escape pods and bringing the crew members aboard and providing medical attention, and Daniel sat in his chair and stared. The Valiant's engines flared bright as Amy pushed the small frigate into a steep dive toward the asteroid field, and the 3 Vorlak warships followed with weapons charging, and they moved with the casual confidence of predators chasing wounded prey, and they expected this chase to last only minutes before they could destroy the human ship and return to the raid. Daniel watched the tactical display as the distance closed between them and the asteroids, and he could see the red icons representing The enemy ships getting closer, and he knew that timing would be everything, because if they entered the asteroid field too early, the Vorlak might suspect a trap, and if they waited too long, they would be in weapons range, and the Valiant's shields would not hold up against even a single volley from those massive cannons. Maya counted down the seconds in a calm voice, and she watched the sensor readings and calculated firing solutions and approach vectors, and when the moment was right, she said now. And Amy threw the Valiant into a hard turn that pushed the inertial dampeners to their limits and sent the small ship diving between two large asteroids. The Vorlak ships followed without hesitation, and they were larger and less maneuverable, but they were also faster and more powerful. And their commanders were certain that the asteroids would not save the human ship from destruction, and they pushed their vessels deeper into the field, while their weapons officers locked targeting. Solutions. Peter sat in the engineering bay watching his console, and he had been working for 6 hours straight, modifying every maintenance drone and repair bot they had, and now those drones were scattered throughout the asteroid field waiting, in silence and attached to asteroids or floating in the shadows, and each one carried explosive charges that Peter had carefully calibrated for maximum effect. The first Vorlak warship passed within range of 3 of Peter's modified drones, and the ship's sensors detected them, but classified them as debris or inactive equipment and dismissed them as no threat. And that dismissal lasted exactly as long as it took for Peter to activate the drones remotely. The 3 drones detached from their hiding places, and their small engines pushed them toward the warship's hull, and they moved quickly and silently. And the Vorlak crew never saw them coming, because they were focused on chasing the Valiant and destroying it. And they did not think to watch for threats that came from below. The drones attached to the hull plating near sensor arrays and communication dishes and cooling vents, and then they detonated in perfectly timed sequence, and the explosions were small compared to the massive size of the warship. But they were placed with surgical precision at vulnerable points, and the effect was immediate. Sensor arrays shattered into fragments and went dark, and communication dishes were torn apart and stopped transmitting, and one cooling vent was blown completely open, exposing the delicate systems beneath, and atmosphere began venting from the breach, and the warship suddenly found itself blind and deaf and overheating on the Valiant's bridge. Maya said that first. Blood belonged to humanity, and her voice held grim satisfaction as she watched the damaged warship begin to slow and fall behind, and the other 2 Vorlak ships reacted immediately by reducing speed and beginning to scan for threats, and their casual confidence was replaced by sudden caution. Amy took advantage of that caution by activating the false sensor echoes she had programmed, and suddenly the Vorlak sensors showed multiple contacts appearing throughout the asteroid field, and their computers registered what looked like 4 more human frigates, and the enemy commanders had to decide whether these contacts were real or fake, and that decision cost them precious seconds. The second wave of drones struck while the Vorlak were still processing the sensor data, and this time 6 drones hit the second warship, and they targeted weapon emplacements and engine housings and shield generators, and more explosions rippled across the hull, and the warship began to list as its stabilizers failed and atmosphere streamed from multiple breaches. Daniel ordered Amy to bring them about, and the Valiant emerged from behind a large asteroid with all weapons firing, and the kinetic cannons that were designed for precision, rather than heavy damage, now targeted the exposed cooling vent on the first warship, and rounds punched through the opening and tore into internal systems, and machinery began to fail, and power fluctuated, and the massive warship went dark. One warship was crippled and drifting, and another was damaged and struggling to maintain course, and the third had stopped its advance completely and was scanning desperately for more threats. And on the Vorlak flagship, Warlord Kraven stared at his tactical display in disbelief. He demanded to know how a single human frigate had damaged 2 of his warships, and his tactical officer reported that the humans were using unconventional tactics and small explosive devices and hit-and-run attacks, and they were not fighting like council species who followed established rules of engagement and used predictable strategies. Kraven's anger was cold and focused, and he ordered his entire fleet to advance and bombard the asteroid field, and he wanted every rock larger than a transport ship reduced to dust, and he wanted the human ship destroyed completely, and he wanted to make an example that would show the galaxy what happened when inferior species tried to resist the Vorlak. The Vorlak fleet opened. Fire with their heavy weapons and asteroids began exploding into clouds of debris, and the space around the Valiant became a storm of fragments and shrapnel, and Amy pushed her piloting skills to their absolute limit as she twisted and dove through. The chaos and pieces of rock peppered the hull, and alarms blared as systems began to fail. Lisa reported that shields were down to 40% and they had hull breaches on 3 decks and casualties in engineering, and they could not keep this up much longer. And Daniel checked the evacuation status and saw that they still needed 90 more minutes before the transports could leave. And he asked Maya if she had anything else. Maya was already working, and her fingers moved across her console, and she called down to Peter in engineering and told him she needed him in the shuttle bay immediately, and to bring every remaining drone and every explosive charge they had left. And Peter grabbed 2 other young crew members, and they began loading equipment onto the ship's single shuttle. Karen Price was 20 years old and worked as a systems technician, and she moved with quick efficiency as she helped load the drones, and Jake Morris was 23 and served as a weapons specialist. And between the 3 of them, they got everything loaded in less than 5 minutes. Maya explained her plan to Daniel, and she said they would use the shuttle as bait and program it to broadcast a distress signal that would make it look like an escape pod. And the Vorlak loved taking prisoners because that was part of their raiding culture, and they would bring the shuttle aboard, and then every drone on that shuttle would detonate inside their hangar. Bay Daniel saw immediately how dangerous this plan was, and he asked who would pilot the shuttle out far enough to be convincing. And Peter volunteered before anyone else could speak, and he said someone had to do it, and it might as well be him, and Karen and Jake both said they would go. Daniel looked at these 3 young people who were barely more than kids, and he felt his chest tighten because he was sending them into terrible danger. But he also knew they were right and someone had to do this, and he approved the plan and told them to be careful. Peter climbed into the shuttle's pilot seat, and his hands were steady as he ran through the pre-flight checks, and Karen sat at the engineering station ready to monitor the drones, and Jake manned the weapons console even though they would not be firing any weapons, and the shuttle launched from the Valiant's bay and accelerated away from the ship. The shuttle broadcast its distress signal in broken English and Tilqui, and it tumbled as if its engines were damaged, and it looked like exactly what the Vorlak expected to see, which was a desperate escape attempt by fragile humans who were trying to flee. The nearest Vorlak warship detected the signal, and its commander smiled because prisoners were valuable, and humans were rare, and the council would pay well for their return, and he ordered the shuttle to be brought aboard with a tractor beam, and the massive ship adjusted course to intercept. Peter watched the Vorlak warship grow larger in his viewport, and he could see the hangar bay doors opening like a mouth ready to swallow them, and he waited until the tractor beam locked onto the shuttle and began pulling them in, and then he looked at Karen and Jake and said it was time to go. The 3 of them moved to the back of the shuttle where an escape pod was waiting, and they climbed inside and sealed the hatch, and Peter initiated the launch sequence, and the pod shot out of the shuttle just as it was being pulled into the Vorlak hangar. Bay the Valiant detected the escape pod immediately, and Amy brought the ship around at maximum speed and used their own tractor beam to grab the pod and pull it aboard, and all 3 young crew members were safe and breathing hard and shaking from adrenaline but alive. Inside the Vorlak hangar bay, the shuttle doors opened and dozens of modified drones poured out, and the Vorlak crew members who had come to investigate their prize realized too late what was happening, and the drones spread throughout the hangar and found fuel lines and ammunition stores and power conduits, and then Peter triggered the detonation command. The Vorlak fleet moved through dark space like a pack of metal predators hunting prey that could not fight back, and there were 15 warships in total, and each one was 3 times the size of the Valiant, and their hulls were covered in scars from countless battles, and they moved with the confidence of creatures who had never known defeat, because they had never faced an opponent who could truly challenge them. Warlord Kraven sat in his command throne watching the displays and feeling satisfied with how this raid was going to proceed, because Haven's Rest was defenseless and the Tilqui were known throughout the galaxy as a species that would not even think of fighting back, and the council would arrive too late, as they always did, and by then the Vorlak would have taken everything valuable and disappeared back into dark space where council ships could not follow. On Haven's Rest, the evacuation had already begun, but it was going badly because the Tilqui had never planned for war or invasion. and their cities were built around beautiful water gardens and meditation centers, and they had no fortifications or shelters or evacuation procedures, and the transport ships that the council had sent were too few and too small, and there were 3 million people who needed to be moved and only enough space for half of them. The Valiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel 6 hours before the Vorlak fleet was scheduled to arrive, and Daniel stood on the bridge looking at the planet below and seeing the lights of cities that would soon be burning if nothing changed. And he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders because he had brought his crew into this situation, and now he needed to figure out how to keep them alive while buying time for the evacuation. Lisa worked her console quickly and efficiently as she assessed their situation, and she reported that 2 million civilians were still on the surface, and the transport ships were overloaded and refusing to leave until everyone was aboard, which was noble but impractical. And the Vorlak would arrive in 6 hours, and the transports needed at least 8 hours to finish loading. Everyone, Maya stood at the tactical station looking at the sensor data and running calculations, and she said quietly that they were 1 frigate against 15 warships, and the Valiant was not designed for fleet combat, and they had kinetic cannons and missile pods but not nearly enough firepower to destroy even one of those massive Vorlak ships in a direct fight. Daniel listened to all of this, and then he asked Maya what assets they had, and she smiled in a way that was not entirely pleasant, and she said they had the Valiant, and they had 32 crew members, and they had something the Vorlak did not expect, which was human creativity and the willingness to fight. Dirty Daniel understood what she meant, and he called for all crew members to assemble in the main hangar bay because if they were going to do this, then everyone deserved to know what they were volunteering for, and within 20 minutes the entire crew was gathered, and they ranged in age from 19 to 53, and there were engineers and medical staff, and pilots and soldiers, and some of them had families back on Earth, and all of them had joined the Earth Defense Force knowing that humanity was considered the junior member of the galactic community. Daniel stood before them, and his voice was calm and steady as he explained the situation, and he told them that in 6 hours, 15 Vorlak warships would arrive and would attack this planet, and 2 million Tilqui civilians were still on the surface and would not be evacuated in time. And the Council's response fleet would not arrive for another 40 hours, and the Valiant was all that stood between those civilians and death. He paused and let them absorb that information, and then he said that he was not going to order anyone to stay, and he explained that the Catharan thought humans were fragile and needed protection, and had made it clear that humans were not ready for the dangers of the galaxy, and if anyone wanted to leave and return to Earth, then he would understand, and no one would think less of them. The hangar was completely silent for several long seconds, and then a young voice spoke from the back of the group. And it was Peter Cole, who was the youngest member of the crew at 19 years old, and he was a maintenance technician who had barely finished his training, and he had sandy hair and a face that still looked boyish. Peter said that his grandmother had survived the Chicago fires, and his grandfather had fought in the border wars, and humans did not run when people needed help, and that was not who they were, and that was not what they did. Another voice joined in, and it belonged to Amy Liu, who was a 22-year-old pilot, and she said that her parents had come from the flood zones and had rebuilt their entire lives from nothing, and if they could do that, then she could fly against some ugly warships. One by one the crew voiced their agreement, and they did not speak with false bravado or reckless courage, but with the quiet determination of people who understood exactly what they were choosing and who had decided that some things were worth the risk. Lisa stepped forward and said with respect that if Daniel tried to send anyone away, he would have a mutiny on his hands, because they were all staying, and they were all going to see this through together. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, and it was a mixture of pride and fear and hope all tangled together, and he looked at his crew and saw in their faces the same stubborn determination that had carried humanity through every crisis in its history, and he nodded and asked Maya to explain her plan. Maya activated the tactical display and showed the approaching Vorlak fleet and the planet below, and she said they could not fight the enemy head-on because they did not have the firepower, and they would be destroyed in minutes if they tried. But they did not need to destroy the Vorlak fleet, and they only needed to slow them down and make them cautious and buy time for the evacuation to finish. She explained that the Vorlak relied on intimidation and overwhelming force, and they had never faced an opponent that used guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run attacks and the Valiant could use the asteroid field near the planet's fourth moon as cover, and they could use every dirty trick that humanity had ever invented, because unlike the Council species, humans actually knew how to fight dirty and were not afraid to do it. Peter spoke up again and said he could modify the maintenance drones to carry explosive charges, and they were small enough to avoid detection on most sensors, and they could be used as proximity mines scattered throughout the asteroid field. Amy nodded and said she could program false sensor echoes that would make it look like there were more ships than just the Valiant, and she could create phantom contacts that would force the Vorlak to split their attention and waste time investigating ghost targets. Other crew members began offering suggestions and ideas, and within minutes they had the outline of a plan that was desperate and dangerous and completely insane. But it was also exactly the kind of creative thinking that had gotten humanity through every impossible situation in its history. Daniel listened to all of it, and then he looked around at his crew one more time, and he saw these humans who the galaxy considered too fragile to fight, and he saw nothing but determination and courage and the willingness to face impossible odds because it was the right thing to do. He said they had 6 hours to prepare, and they should show the Vorlak what fragile really meant, and the crew dispersed to their stations and began working with focused intensity. And Peter gathered a team of engineers and started modifying every drone and automated system they had. And Amy went to the bridge to begin programming her false sensor signatures, and everyone else found their own way to contribute. The Valiant moved into position near the asteroid field and waited, and the crew worked without stopping, and they knew that what they were about to attempt had never been done before, and that the odds were heavily against them, but they also knew that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do, and that knowledge gave them strength. 6 hours later, the Vorlak fleet emerged from dark space, and their massive ships appeared on sensors like angry red blotches, and they moved toward Haven's Rest with steady confidence, and on the Valiant alarms began to sound, and crew members moved to battle stations, and Daniel stood on the bridge and took a deep breath. Maya reported that the Vorlak had detected them, and were adjusting course, and 3 ships were breaking formation to intercept and destroy the human frigate. And Daniel asked if they were ready, and Maya smiled and said they were as ready as they would ever be. The Vorlak commander was amused when he saw the single small ship waiting for them, and he ordered 3 of his warships to destroy it quickly so they could proceed with the raid, and he did not consider the human frigate to be a real threat because the reports said humans were fragile and weak, and the Council had classified them as needing protection. The 3 Vorlak warships accelerated toward the Valiant, and their weapon systems powered up, and they expected this to be over in minutes, because how could one small ship pose any challenge to 3 massive warships? But they were about to learn something that the Council had not understood, and that was that humans might be fragile, but they were also dangerous in ways that no one expected. The Galactic Council had been watching Earth for 3 years before they decided to make contact, and the decision came after long debates about whether humans were ready to join the greater community of spacefaring species, and the answer, according to most members, was that humans were not ready at all, but they needed to be told the rules anyway, because Earth had developed faster-than-light communication, and it was only a matter of time before they figured out faster-than-light travel too, and the Council preferred to guide new species rather than let them stumble into dangerous territory alone. The Catharian were chosen as Earth's introduction guides, and they were a species of tall insectoid beings with hard shells covering their bodies and 4 arms that moved with precision and efficiency, and they had been part of the Council for over 1,000 years and had helped dozens of species make the transition to galactic citizenship, and their reports on humanity were detailed and not particularly flattering. Ambassador Zixtel stood before the Council holding a data tablet that contained 3 years' worth of observations about humans, and he clicked his mandibles together as he spoke, which the translation devices rendered as a tone of mild concern mixed with confusion. And he said that humans were perhaps the most fragile species they had ever considered for Council membership, and he listed the reasons one by one. Humans had no natural armor or protective shells, like the Catharian, and they had no venomous defenses like the Silthar, and they had no ability to survive in vacuum, even for a few seconds, like the Nexul, and their bodies were soft and easily damaged, and their bones broke under relatively small amounts of pressure, and their skin tore from simple impacts, and they required a very narrow range of temperatures to survive, and even small variations could kill them within hours. But what concerned Zixtal most was how long human children took to mature, and he explained that humans were born completely helpless and unable to walk or feed themselves or communicate beyond crying, and it took them a full year just to learn to walk, and many more years before they could survive on their own, and some species on the council matured in weeks or months, and even the slowest species were independent within 2 years, but humans required nearly 2 decades to reach full maturity. The council listened to all of this and debated among themselves, and finally they reached a decision, and they would offer Earth provisional membership, but humans would be classified as a protected fragile species category 7, and this meant that humans would have severe restrictions placed on them, and they would need escorts for any travel beyond their own solar system, and they could not build military vessels larger than small frigates, and they could not colonize new worlds without council approval for each planet, and most importantly, they would be monitored constantly to ensure they did not get themselves killed through ignorance or accident. Captain Daniel Hayes received the news while standing on the bridge of the orbital station that Earth had built in preparation for first contact, and he was a man in his early 40s with gray starting to show at his temples and lines around his eyes that came from years of military service, and he had been chosen to represent Earth's military forces during the first meeting because he had a reputation for staying calm under pressure and not saying things he would regret. Later standing next to him was Lieutenant Maya Brooks, who served as his tactical officer, and she was known for being able to read situations quickly and figure out what people were really saying behind their diplomatic words, and she looked at the data packet that the Catharine had sent ahead of their arrival, and she frowned as she read through the restrictions and classifications. The Catharine delegation arrived exactly on schedule, and they materialized on the observation deck using their advanced transportation technology, and Zixtal was even taller in person than he had appeared in the holographic communications, and his chitinous plates gleamed under the station's lights, and his forearms moved in what the translation software said was a formal greeting, though his mandibles clicked in a way that suggested he was not particularly impressed with what he saw. Daniel stepped forward and extended his hand in the traditional human greeting, and Zixtal looked at the hand for a moment before reaching out with one of his own hands, and the grip was brief and formal, and then they got down to business. Zixtal explained that the council had reviewed Earth's application for membership and had decided to grant provisional status, and he said this as if he was doing humanity a great favor, and then he began listing all the restrictions and limitations, and Daniel listened without interrupting, even though he could feel his jaw tightening with each new rule. Maya was less patient, and when Zixtal finished his speech, she spoke up and said that humanity appreciated the council's concern, but that they were more resilient than the reports suggested, and she pointed out that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and devastating wars, and had not only survived but had thrived and rebuilt and continued to push forward. Zixtal's mandibles clicked again, and the translation software labeled it as dismissive amusement, and he said that humans had never faced a true threat, and that they had lived in a protected bubble on their little planet without understanding how hostile and dangerous the galaxy really was, and he said there were species out there that could crush Earth's strongest soldiers without effort, and environments that would kill humans in seconds, and the Council had seen hundreds of species like humanity who thought they were tough until they encountered real danger. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, and the Catharan outlined every single rule and restriction, and they made it very clear that humans were being treated like children who needed constant supervision and protection. And Daniel remained professional throughout, but inside, he was angry and frustrated because he knew that humanity was capable of so much more than these aliens gave them credit for. When the delegation finally left, Maya stood at the viewport looking down at Earth, and she said quietly that the Catharan thought humans were weak, and Daniel replied that they should let the aliens think whatever they wanted because actions would speak louder than reports or classifications. 3 months passed, and Earth began adjusting to its new status as a junior member of the galactic community, and human ships were built according to Council specifications which meant small and lightly armed, and human exploration was limited to areas that the Council deemed safe, which meant places that had already been fully explored and mapped and deemed boring. The Earth Defense Force was allowed to operate 5 frigates beyond the solar system, and Daniel was given command of one of them, and the ship was called the Valiant. And it was small compared to the massive warships that other species operated, but it was well built and had a good crew, and Daniel was determined to prove that humans could handle themselves. The crew of the Valiant was a mix of ages and backgrounds, and there were experienced officers like Commander Lisa Grant, who served as first officer, and there were young recruits fresh out of training like Peter Cole, who was only 19 and worked in maintenance and engineering, and Maya had transferred to the Valiant as tactical officer because she wanted to be out in space rather than stuck on a station. They were on a routine patrol near the outer colonies when the distress call came through, and it was from a planet called Haven's Rest. And the message was urgent and panicked, and it said that a Vorlak fleet had been detected heading toward their world, and they needed immediate assistance. Daniel knew about the Vorlak, and everyone in the galaxy knew about them, and they were raiders and conquerors who had rejected the Council's authority and lived by taking what they wanted from weaker civilizations, and their ships were massive and brutal and covered in weapons and armor, and they had never been defeated in open combat. The distress call said that Haven's Rest had 48 hours before the Vorlak arrived, and the planet was home to over 3 million Tilqui civilians, and the Tilqui were a peaceful species who had never known war and had no weapons or military, and the Council's nearest battle fleet was 2 days away at maximum speed, which meant they would arrive too late. Daniel looked at the message and then at his crew, and he knew what he had to do, even though it violated every restriction the Council had placed on humanity, and Lisa reminded him that they were not authorized to engage in military action without Council approval, and that interfering could cause a diplomatic incident. But Daniel was looking at the numbers, and he was seeing 3 million civilians who were about to die, and he was thinking about how the Catharan had said humans were too fragile and too weak to handle the dangers of the galaxy, and he made his decision. He ordered Lisa to plot a course for Haven's Rest at maximum speed, and he opened a channel to Earth Command to inform them of what he was about to do. And then he looked at his crew, and he told them that they were going to do something that would probably get them all court-martialed, but that it was the right thing to do. The Valiant's engines flared to life, and the small frigate turned toward Haven's Rest and began accelerating, and they had 12 hours to reach the planet before the Vorlak arrived, and Daniel had no idea how one small ship could possibly hold off an entire fleet. But he knew they had to try, because that was what humans did when people needed help. 3 days after the battle, Daniel stood before the Galactic Council in their grand chamber on Nexus Prime, and his uniform was new and crisp because his old one had been destroyed and ruined beyond repair, and the only visible sign of what he had been through was a white bandage on his temple covering stitches from where his head had hit a console during the fighting. The council chamber was enormous and built like an amphitheater, with seats rising in tiers around a central platform, where Daniel stood, and representatives from hundreds of different species filled those seats, and all of them were watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to respect to confusion, and the weight of their attention was almost physical. Zixtal stood at his own podium, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly in agitation, and he began speaking before anyone else could, and he said that the human ship had violated direct orders from the council and had engaged in military action without proper authorization, and had used tactics that were barbaric and uncivilized, and had risked causing an interstellar incident that could have had serious consequences. Council Chair Gorath interrupted Zixtal with a voice that resonated through the chamber like music played on crystal, and he said that the humans had saved 2 million lives while the Council's own forces were too far away to help, and while diplomats debated protocols and procedures, and he thought the Council owed the humans an explanation before leveling accusations at them. Daniel stepped forward and asked if he could address the Council, and Gorath gestured for him to proceed, and Daniel took a breath and began speaking in a voice that was calm and steady. Despite his exhaustion, he said that the Council had called humans fragile and had classified them as a species that needed protection and was not ready for the dangers of the galaxy, and the Council had looked at human bodies and seen soft flesh, with no armor and no natural weapons and no ability to survive in harsh environments, and had concluded that humans were weak, he paused and looked around the chamber at all the different species, and he said that the council was not entirely wrong, because humans were physically fragile compared to many other species, and human children did take years to mature, and humans did not have shells or venom or the ability to survive in vacuum, and their bodies were easily damaged, and their bones broke under pressure. But he said the council had made a fundamental mistake and had confused physical fragility with weakness, and had failed to understand what fragility really meant for a species that had survived and thrived despite all those limitations. Behind him on the viewing screen's footage from the battle began to play, and it showed the Valiant dodging through asteroids and Peter's drones attacking the warships and Amy's incredible piloting and the final desperate charge toward the enemy fleet. Daniel gestured to the screens and said that humans were fragile, but they were not weak, and he explained that humans broke easily, but they also healed, and they got knocked down, but they got back up and they faced impossible odds and found ways to win. Not because they were stronger or tougher, but because they refused to give up. He pointed to the screen where Peter's face was visible in the shuttle cockpit, and he said that young man was 19 years old and barely more than a child by human standards, but he had flown into danger without hesitation because he understood something important. And Daniel asked the council if they wanted to know why a single frigate had held off an entire fleet. He said it was because that ship was crewed by humans who had grown up fragile and vulnerable, and who had learned from the very beginning of their lives that courage was not the absence of fear, but was the choice to move forward despite being afraid, and that being able to be hurt did not mean you had to hide from danger when others needed help. The chamber was completely silent now, and every ambassador was listening carefully, and Daniel continued speaking, and he said that the council had built a galaxy where the strong protected the weak and where the tough shielded the fragile, and that was admirable and good. But it had also created a galaxy where no one remembered how to fight against real odds, and where everyone waited for someone stronger to solve their problems. He talked about the Tilqui and how they were a peaceful species, which was beautiful, but when the Vorlok came they were helpless, because no one had ever taught them that peace required the willingness to defend it, and that being peaceful did not mean being passive. Daniel looked directly at Zixtal and said that the Catharan had called humans fragile and had said they needed protection, and those things were true. But when the moment came and civilians needed saving and every second counted, it was not the Council's warships that held the line, but a crew of fragile humans, many of them barely more than children, who decided that having soft bodies did not mean having soft hearts. He turned back to face Goreth and the rest of the Council, and he said that humans did not want to be classified as a protected fragile species, and did not want to be treated as wards of the galaxy who needed constant supervision, and instead they wanted to be partners and equals, and allies who could help build a better galaxy, but they were going to do it their way, which meant helping people first and asking for authorization. Later Goreth was silent for a long moment, and light refracted through his crystalline body in patterns that suggested he was thinking deeply. And then he leaned forward and said that Daniel made a compelling argument, though he noticed that Daniel had conveniently left out the part where he had violated several dozen regulations and had nearly started a diplomatic incident. Daniel replied that he had mentioned they asked for authorization later had he not, and his tone was respectful, but there was the ghost of a smile on his face. A sound rippled through the chamber, and it took Daniel a moment to realize it was laughter, or the various alien equivalents of laughter, and the tension that had been thick in the air suddenly broke, and even Zixtal's mandibles stopped their agitated clicking. Goreth announced that the Council would debate Earth's classification and status, but he suspected the outcome would be very different from their previous assessment, and he said that the humans had shown the Council something important that they had forgotten, which was that sometimes the most fragile things were also the strongest. The session ended, and Daniel left the chamber and found his crew waiting outside in a corridor, and they had all been given medical treatment and new uniforms, and they looked tired but healthy, and Peter was there with Karen and Jake and Amy and Lisa and Maya and all the others who had turned one small frigate into a legend. Peter asked how it had gone, and Daniel looked at his crew, and he thought about how these fragile humans had faced warships and impossible odds and had won through sheer determination and creativity. And he said that he thought they had changed. Some minds Maya asked what minds they had changed, and Daniel said that the council was starting to understand that being breakable did not mean being broken, and that being vulnerable did not mean being victims, and that sometimes the softest hearts beat with the strongest courage. They walked through the halls of the council building together and past aliens from dozens of species who now looked at humans differently, and not with pity for their fragility, but with respect for what they had accomplished despite their physical limitations. Back on Earth, the news of what was being called the Battle of Haven's Rest spread quickly, and humanity had proven itself not through superior strength or advanced technology, but through the qualities that had always defined them, which were adaptability and creativity and determination, and the absolute refusal to watch innocent people die when something could be done to help. The Catharian eventually became humanity's strongest allies after Zixtal spent time actually getting to know humans instead of just studying them from a distance. And he wrote later that humans had taught him the difference between fragility and weakness and between protection and patronization. And he admitted that his initial reports had been wrong in fundamental ways. The Vorlak never raided Council space again, because the story of how a single human frigate had held off their entire fleet became a legend and a warning, and they learned that humans might break easily, but they would fight back with everything they had and would find ways to hurt you that you never expected. On planets throughout the galaxy, parents began telling their children about the fragile humans who had soft bodies and breakable bones, and who took years to grow strong, but who had faced impossible odds and won anyway. And they told their children that sometimes the most powerful force in the galaxy was not physical strength, but the courage to stand up despite being fragile. 5 years later, Admiral Daniel Hayes stood before the Council again, and this time he was there to accept the Council's highest honor, which was called the Star of Valor, and was awarded to those who showed exceptional courage in defense of innocent lives, and behind him stood his crew, all of them now decorated heroes. As Gorath placed the medal around Daniel's neck, the crystalline being spoke quietly so only Daniel could hear, and he said that the Council had called humanity fragile and had been correct, but had failed to understand that fragility was not weakness. And he said that humans were like living crystal that grew stronger from every break, and that each fracture created new ways to catch and reflect light. Daniel thanked him and said the real honor belonged to his crew, because